Another scientific theory born around the time of Aristotle was the law of use and disuse, also called the law of acquired characteristics. Scientists thought that animals could change themselves through effort, and these changes would be passed on to the next generation. Darwin used this law to explain evolution. He believed a species could improve itself through effort, that if an animal exercised and developed large muscles, its offspring would ultimately be born with larger muscles. This idea is not true. Even if you exercised your body every day and developed enormous muscles, your child would not be born brawny. Muscle building has no effect on the DNA of the reproductive cells and cannot be passed on to the next generation.
Well, actually, of course, Lamarck and Darwin knew nothing about genes or genetics at all. It wasn't invented till long after. They understood heredity, but not genetics. But they didn't understand what the mechanisms of. In fact, they went down some wrong paths on that part. But that's okay. That's it was reasonable at the time for them to think that.
Darwin also thought that if an animal did not use a body part, such as a leg or an eye, its offspring would eventually be born without these. He envisioned animals shedding body parts this way through the law of disuse. For example, he suggested that the eyes of a mole became covered with fur and smaller because the mole did not use them underground. But this idea is genetically impossible. Using or not using a body part has no effect on the DNA of the reproductive cells and cannot be passed on to the next generation. If you put an eye patch on a baby at birth and left it there till adulthood, that person's offspring would still be born with normal eyes. Disuse of a body part has no effect on the next generation. In the late 19th century, a scientist with a vivid imagination and a butcher knife put the law of disuse to rest and caused an enormous difficulty for Darwin's theory.
A man by the name of August Weismann devised a simple experiment in which he kept cutting off the tails of mice, and he did this for 20-odd generations, and the mice still had tails.
With this simple experiment, the law of disuse was invalidated. Scientists continued to explore the law of use and later realized that this concept was also genetically impossible. Any change to body cells has no effect on the DNA in the reproductive cells and therefore cannot be passed on to the next generation.
The impact of that experiment and of other skeptical biologists essentially left an explanation for evolution sort of up in the air. And biologists were, although many of them felt that there were changes among organisms, they still felt that there was no adequate explanation to explain these changes.
Unfortunately, much of the public believes the law of use and disuse is a valid idea, partly because scientists occasionally describe the mechanism for evolution in these terms. Charles Darwin suggested that an individual animal could adapt to the environment, but surprisingly, this concept is now considered outdated. For example, a lizard could not grow fur simply because of a sudden cooling of the climate. Even if a skin cell could grow a hair, there's no way for the skin cell to pass this information to the reproductive cells. The reproductive cells, such as the eggs, cannot get signals from the outside environment or signals from the body cells. Because of these difficulties, some biologists have suggested eliminating the concept of direct adaptation altogether. Unfortunately, some naturalists and even university professors still speak in terms of these disproved and outdated mechanisms.
The outside environment is changing, therefore the organism has to adjust to those changes if he wants to survive. And even your DNA is getting signals, your DNA in your egg is getting signals from the outside. And those signals are being translated through stress in your body.
This statement is biologically impossible. There is no way to signal the DNA in the reproductive cells as this scientist suggests. Sometimes when one group of scientists disproves a concept, other scientists continue to promote these false ideas for decades, if not centuries.